watch your arm there.
Which arm?
Your microphone. Can you bring that up a little bit? Your microphone.
Yeah.
Get a little bit closer to. Hey, if you got this part of the video, you've got the live unedited edition. Cyber Frontiers. Christian, it's been a long time since I've said that sentence.
How about them apples?
How about them apples? It's 65 tonight, Cyber Frontier 65. And we'll get started here in just a second. Big thanks to those of you joining us out there in the chat room. John, who will probably tell us he has to go to bed in about 30 minutes. So, John, it's been great having you for the first part of the show. Then Tony, Ken, Brian, thanks for coming out. Good to see you guys. Christian will be open to questions tonight. So if you've got those going on, do you have earbuds in or no? Am I coming out through speakers?
I am, yeah. We haven't solved some of the problems yet.
Are you not able to? Well, you're going to do most of the talking, so it doesn't really matter.
Give me a minute.
Yeah.
Able to solve this.
Yeah, no worries. John, even retired, like the last couple of times I've tried to keep you around for the show, you're like, I got to go to bed, guys. Dude, I thought you were retired. I'd never go to bed if I was retired. I mean, I'd literally never go to bed. So, John, that's what I thought. I thought that was the case, that you didn't have to get up for work, but the last couple home gadget geeks you come to, you've like halfway through the show, you've been like, I got to go to bed, guys. I'm sorry, maybe we were that boring. Maybe that's the problem. That's probably it, Christian. I'd say maybe we were just boring.
Probably.
So John says old folks can't stay up late. I don't believe that. I think he can make it. I think us old folks don't even need as much sleep as you young kids, Christian. Like, I mean,
it is true.
I'm having trouble stringing 6 hours together. Like, I can't, if I go to bed early, like 9, let's just say, and there's been a couple nights I've been really tired, I'm up at 1. Like, that's it. You're done. Enjoy your morning because it's going to be long. So I don't know, man. I as I'm getting older, I just am not. I'm sure you can. Can you still can you do like 14 hours?
Christian? Is that a John question or a me question?
No, that's a Christian question. Can you do like 14? Can you stack like 14 hours of sleep in there if you need to?
It's tough. I think 12 is about the most I could go.
Yeah. Oh, well, John says perhaps no, John, it's on me. Must not be exciting enough to hold your interest.
Wow.
So, well, you're going to want to return tomorrow night, John. This is your sweet spot. We're talking home theater. So I'm sure it's me, Christian. I'm sure I'm just not, I'm not that exciting on
It's a good sign. It means you're a good mediator. Very soothing.
Maybe I should start like a good night podcast where I just talk and people are like, good night. Good night. I'm going to bed now. I get it. All right. Let's crank this thing over and get some chat going on here. Gentlemen.
How's the feedback?
1, 2, 3. Better.
Cool.
What'd you do?
Turn the volume down.
That's what I thought.
I have to get a long run audio cable set back up to get the earbud piece because ever since I switched setups, I have disabled 2 sources of earbud input I used to have analog, so it's tough.
No worries. You're going to do most of the talking, so we'll be just fine. So, okay, let me. As my iPhone is rebooting from the security patch that we're going to talk about tonight. So, all right, watch that microphone. Here we go.
Are you hearing it from me still? We're going to get it right before we start because I'm not going to do it
just a little. I'm hearing a little desk noise.
Yeah, I was thinking of one last ditch effort here before I.
Okay. I'll give
up the ghost. All right, give me one more sec on this.
Okay. All right. So John is. So Wednesday nights are better for you because like, something going on Friday morning that I don't know about, or I don't understand. It's okay. I my ego can take it. It's all right. I am all right with it. Crypto's all over the place, by the way. Just all over the place. Crazy and all over the place. We will wait for Christian here to make his way back in. So any night, John, is what you're telling me. Any night is a good night. So tomorrow night, whole show. By the way, we've had some crypto on the post show, but you've gone to bed early. So just I don't know. I hear one thing and I see another, Christian. I just don't know. Oh, software update is complete. Your phone has been updated.
How about now?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I think we're okay.
Cool.
Just watch that. Watch hitting that thing.
Yeah.
Don't
super goofy.
Just makes the oddest ring.
I'm cheating on cable length only slightly.
Yeah, okay. All right. You're as long as you're not like your head is like stuck like in this position because you can't. You're like
yeah.
All right. Brian says more crypto chat than ever, especially since they've had some Super Bowl commercials. Yeah, I tell you what, the crypto landscape, Christian, the retail crypto landscape has changed drastically since the last time we did this. I mean, it's kind of gone the way of gambling. Like
yep.
At the same time, gambling sites and crypto sites have taken over.
Have converged. Yeah.
It's just,
and I feel like we've talked about a fair amount of the speculative reservation I had about the whole thing, but I still don't think the jury's out. This could just be another phase as far as I'm concerned. It's not just volatile in the way it's behaving in terms of what you can do with it. It's volatile in the ways that we're seeing it for what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah. Well, the crazy thing is they've both gone through, both crypto and the gambling sites have gone through similar, I think, regulatory waves where, gambling got really big for a while, DraftKings and all those. Then they all got smacked down. Crypto was kind of the same way. There's all these, we're going to do this stuff. And the U.S. government was like, no, you're not. And then whoop, down they went. And then they've come back in kind of legitimate ways. This year, just watching football, I was so surprised to see all this legitimate. I mean, it's sanctioned now. It's legal. And it was legal before, but it was just a little sketchy, right?
Yeah.
Some of the stuff they were doing. And they've kind of emerged into a more regulated, like where the NFL is endorsing it, and you're like, holy crap, if the NFL's endorsing it. So
I think they're far more regulated than Bitcoin is still.
Oh, infinitely. Infinitely. Yeah.
Infinitely. Bitcoin's very early in the regulation phase still.
Yeah. That is for sure. All right, let's get this thing. Let's get this thing rolling. Here we go. This is the Average Guy Network, and you have found Cyber Frontiers, show number 65, recorded on February 16th, 2022. Here on Cyber Frontiers, we explore cybersecurity, big data, and the technologies that are shaping the future. If you have questions, comments, or contributions, you can always send us an email. You can send me an email, jim@theaverageguy.tv, or you can send one over to Christian if you want to do that. It's actually more efficient that way. Christian@theaverageguy.tv. Find me on Twitter @jcarlson. Of course, Christian, you can find him at Borg Whisperer. TheAverageGuy.tv is powered by Maple Grove Partners. Get secure, reliable, high-speed hosting from folks that you know and trust. For more information and for plans reasonably priced when everything else is following the path of inflation, MapleGrovePartners.com. Christian, welcome back to Cyber Frontiers. I can successfully say on this podcast, we never said 2021 ever. Welcome back.
Welcome back into 2022. But we also said that it's always up to date, but never on a schedule. So we continue that trend as well.
We did say that for a while. We got back together and said, we got to do this. I'm going to get you on the calendar at least once a month. That just seems to be, and I think I get you a couple months at a time scheduled out. So we at least hit it. And then I'll probably produce these on the off week during the week when we're not doing Home Gadget Geeks. So we'll get that said. And if you're joining us for the first time, you're like, well, wait a minute, there's 64 episodes ahead of this. Yeah, there are. You can go back. We've been doing this for a long time, couple of year, and been having a good time doing it. If you're joining us, maybe from Home Gadget Geeks, maybe you heard me talk about this on Home Gadget Geeks, or it just showed up in your feed again. Welcome back. We'll try and have these kind of once a month so for you. Christian, catch us up a little bit. We spent a little time with you on Home Gadget Geeks, but from a big data cybersecurity standpoint, why don't you just give us kind of a rundown? I mean, the last time we met, October of 2020, we had Bitdefender on. We were talking a little bit about what they were doing, but man, a lot has changed since October of 2020. I'm not asking for a complete rundown, but just give me some highlights.
Yeah, I mean, a tremendous amount has changed, right? From March 2020, which I really think of as February, March 2020 is really kind of the landing zone nexus target of COVID in the United States, and just looking at some of those early predictions we had about, I remember when we, in some of the last episodes, we talked about really just kind of things that would seem mundane to us on any other show or topic that suddenly became really important, right? Like, well, does the internet have enough infrastructure in the US to handle everyone working from home? I don't know. Let's find out. Everyone's working from home now. It's shut down. And we've seen kind of quick, dramatic evolutions in enterprise industrial preferences for what it means to be a remote worker. What the teleworkspace environment looks like. We probably accelerated at least 10 years in adoption timeframes, and companies by and large, for the positions that can do it, have taken much more aggressive stances. And basically, being able to hire and retain talent is now one facet of that optimization curve, so to speak, is whether or not you offer remote work, and how does it compare up to these other companies. So with that change in cultural mindset has come a lot more thinking about, well, really, how ready are we to have sensitive work conversations at home, handle work technology at home, secure mobile devices, secure corporate networks, data, assets, systems, and processes. And these are things we've all talked about on the show. But I think one of the areas that has advanced the most in the discussion thread is this notion of zero trust, which, we've talked about before, where it's no longer sufficient just to trust the boundaries of networks and to kind of build these castle walls of different levels of networks and access to systems. But we really have to assume zero trust from the outset, and really place very little to no trust in the actual infrastructure environment that you're in front of or behind, but into the identity, the presence, the actions that you're using to authenticate and identify yourself and perform actions within the system. That has had fairly large implications for where industry is going in this space. We still, I don't think, have hit the maturity curve of zero trust, but we started to hit I would say, a common reference point or a common framework by which people are digesting the requirements and what it really means to say, oh, we're a zero trust architecture, right? That was a very kind of buzzwordy, generic thing in the past. And I think in the last year and a half, we've started to get a lot more fidelity around it, and arguably much quicker than we would otherwise, because of the necessity of supporting these hybrid environments, which is everything I think folks can tell is a long-term trend, right? We're going to have industry and the alike have to support these environments, and they're gonna span people's home networks, people's office networks, people's data centers. It's going to span cloud infrastructure and off-premise and on-premise. So fairly important topic. We've also seen in the last year a fairly I don't know if I would call it disturbing, but I think, certainly seen a regression in the types of zero-day vulnerabilities we're seeing in mobile. Particularly, where I've hit, Google Android fairly hard on the show in the past around just the multitude of concerns from a privacy security perspective, and how those things weren't consistently implemented across different, vendors that consume Android. But we've been seeing it a lot more so in iOS in the last year, which is, to me, a concerning trend. I'm an iPhone user. Um, it's to some extent, you get what you pay for, in terms of you're paying a premium on the hardware and the OS, so that advertising and these other things kind of baked into the Android kernel in some ways is not there as much. Apple has made huge splash waves in privacy that go much further than I think they thought in the mobile industry would go, which is certainly a development since the last show, particularly around, we've seen a 30% decline in Facebook's share price, with a poor revenue outlook for this year. And one of the really telling things was that, part of what they attribute that to is, the Apple App Store and iOS platform is killing us, because, you can turn on all these privacy things that disable ad tracking and these other things that basically are a major revenue stream for the company. So while they've had major success moving the privacy narrative in that aspect, they've also had, in my opinion, an unusual number of 0 days in relation to previous years that are definitional, arbitrary remote code execution requiring no human interaction. And there's been a fairly interesting patch cycle from iOS 13 through iOS 15 of, several critical OSs where you must upgrade this thing now, and no, your phone isn't going to be on a corporate network unless you have this version. And, not a trend that you would see as often with iOS. And I think that just speaks to, we're not there yet in terms of, we talk about data breaches as kind of this iconic holistic thing of early 2010 through 2015, as like, it felt like we were reading about a new data breach every single day. And a lot of the web-based technologies are getting smarter and hardened to the point where that became lesser of a focus. And then it kind of, ransomware picked up from 2016 through the rest of that decade to kind of round out the new class of problems in security in terms of the low-hanging fruit for an adversary. And now we're here in 2022, and we're still seeing a lot of really nasty, security issues across different device platforms that haven't gotten any less significant in scope. But it does still seem like we're on a broader trend of preventing these kind of mass data breaches, worldwide worming type of behavior, ransomware, etc. But for the average consumer as well as the enterprise, like, there's still a lot of cat and mouse going on in security. And so I think that's just an important trend to kind of continue to follow and understand, because we still haven't had a paradigm or a fundamental shift in some type of technology that fundamentally changes the game of how we think about security. It still feels very iterative, very like patching holes and sinking ships sometimes. And we kind of hope zero trust and these other things are going to really get at the kind of foundational tech debt of the internet and technology to start addressing some of these problems. But, think longer term horizon, like 5 to 10 years, to start to see the impacts of some of those things. I still think we're in a horizon where there's going to be plenty of fun, so to speak, in what we see as problem areas for the industry over the next few years. And these topics are just really kind of in the security space and the telework space of COVID. There's obviously been fairly, decent progress across artificial intelligence and machine learning. I feel like Tesla is the classic case study, and what Elon Musk is doing both in the car automation space as well as other industries that he's championing, particularly with Starlink and Neuralink, and some of these things are more controversial than others, but there's a lot going on in that space that is starting to smell a little bit different. So that's cool. Broadly speaking, though, the accessibility and the usability of machine learning has gone up even more so. I mean, through 2021 was a big year for that. I feel like we are at a point where when we started this show, ML was something that academic researchers got in a room and wrote papers about. And in 2022, ML is something where regular enterprises are submitting their data to cloud-based workflows and getting useful statistics and insights out of their data that's actionable business information, without having to have a whole lot of rigor and background knowledge in machine learning. So that's in my opinion, a major milestone for the maturity of that topic. And then we covered this on Home Gadget Geeks more from a consumer perspective. And I think it's great to go back and listen to that show to kind of understand some of the fundamentals. But the whole space around Internet of Things, enterprise networking, kind of what is the next evolution of the internet, both from an infrastructure perspective as much as a web application perspective, is really starting to come into focus and provide new opportunities that support the type of workplace cultures that we're talking about, and kind of home environment just as much as the industrial and enterprise facets. So yeah, lots of incremental progress, nothing that is, show stopping. Oh my gosh, this is the best thing since sliced bread that we missed. But kind of just a high level surveil of where I think we are heading into kind of Q2 of 2022.
You, in that Home Gadget Geek show, you talked me into a 5G router, completely wireless. I've now been for, I don't know, a month or two, month and a half, maybe. 5G, can't tell the difference. I picked up a IPv6 address to begin with, and then it was gone. As quickly it was there, it was gone. I'm back, picking up very random. They change a lot more than Cox does or did for me. Those addresses would stick around a while. These don't seem to, but we're using it right now, and it seems rock solid. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. I want to come back to this. A report in 2021, the year we kind of skipped, a 68% increase in data compromises, like 68%, Christian. And I think we're probably off to a pretty good start for 2022 as well. Is that a trend? Would that have been different if we wouldn't have had a pandemic? Would that have been any different? Or is that just the direction we're heading? At some point, everything's going to be compromised, right? I mean, if when you talk about a 70% increase in a year, you say zero trust, but I mean, what's it going to take to slow this trend down?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because my perspective on this in relation to the statistical data you read is interesting, right? I think in the aggregate, we're doing a better job of, as industry at large, of tamping down on these things. And yet the raw numbers basically say, hey, data compromises were, 23.5% higher in 2021 than they were in 2017. So like, how do you reconcile that data with the viewpoint, right? And one thing I like to think about is, do you have many small sinking ships, or do you have several large sinking ships? Yeah. And what's interesting in unfolding some of this data is that I think there's a lot of small to medium-sized companies that are struggling, that are increasing these numbers. And part of that is it's a failed plumbing and failed infrastructure problem, right? Like, you can have these companies spending their time trying to build foundational services, security capabilities for their business without necessarily having the on-site expertise to do it. Or you can, kind of outsource those things to known, trusted, solid platforms that implement it correctly every single time and build your business logic application on top. And obviously there's shared security implications there that are not always clear to digest in raw numbers. But you're absolutely right that like the ransomware played a big role in the increase of what people consider to be data compromises. But then there's also an alarming number of just breaches, and there's not much to say other than I think in some respects, the level of complexity that we're at needs to change. So like we're getting more complex in how we think about implementing these systems, and what I call the blueprints, or like the solution, the technology solutions we have available to address these problems are dramatically better than they were 10 years ago when we were talking about data breaches. But now we have kind of an implementation and a deployment problem. Where are we consistently implementing and consistently deploying these blueprints across small, medium, large institutions? And I think that is, to me, in my mind, where, I spend a lot of time thinking about, are we consistent as a whole in how to provide real defensive security postures for these systems and have them fail closed and not open. And then there's just the reality of, the adversary has to try harder. And that is because that low-hanging fruit is no longer really as easy in 2022 as it was in 2012. And when the adversary has to try harder, you're going to see more sophisticated and complex attacks that are going to require those next generation of technologies to protect, right? So this is really kind of part of that cat and mouse, where now we're starting to see the next evolution of breaches and ransomware and et cetera. And it's a result of, I think we got to that next rung in the like aggregate infrastructure of the internet and security, and that has closed a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And now the response is, well, the attacks are going to get more sophisticated. So I think that's where you see the increase being driven from. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure that folks really can appreciate yet what the right thing is to double down and focus on first, right? So like two of the big attacks that happened in 2021 that weren't covered on the show is one, Colonial Pipeline, right, which is a gas pipeline in southeast part of the U.S., right, major supplier, and so gas stations were closing, or $8 a gallon, etc. And that was a classic ransomware attack, and then they kind of got the money back, and there's some questions there that will remain unanswered, I think. But impressive for the first time ever I can think of, where a ransom attack of that magnitude resulted in the Department of Justice announcing that its extortion task force had recovered, $2.3 million of the ransomware payment. So that's fairly interesting, right? That's not a very common headline that you read, that you get anything back after paying a ransom. And shortly after Colonial, it was like clockwork, was the meatpacking company JBS had kind of the same business disruption. And so again, we see ransomware kind of replacing the traditional type of breach as a mainline news story, and we see it having the kind of broad impacts that we expect and are concerned with. But it really is a hard commentary to draw the line between what would have been the right thing to secure that Colonial Pipeline over the oodles of other pipelines that are out there, and what would have been the right set of technologies to balance kind of that fully hardened model from the realities of the business as they run it today. So a lot of challenges. And I think we're going to continue to see them until there's broader consensus on what's the minimum set of technologies and frameworks that a business should have to operate in order to be in that industry, right? So if you're in critical infrastructure and you're running a pipeline, you probably should have a standard set of requirements that are set by CISA at DHS to be in business and to do. If you want to do things that have computers plugged into pipelines, then you need to meet a certain set of requirements and demonstrate cybersecurity controls. Much in the same way, if you want to run a commercial data center today, you have to pass a SOC audit, right? Or otherwise, customers aren't going to trust the physical security of their data being protected in the cloud. So we have a lot of standardization work to do as industry, and I think again that's where the next battle is going to be, is where we were lacking technical tools to solve a lot of these problems 5 years ago. Now I think we have these tools, but we don't yet have broad consensus on the standardization and the way forward.
Christian, last year, 2 crypto networks returned. Well, one last year, one this, as we think of the Poly network hacker that returned 600 million or something like that. There's some question. Then recently here, just at the beginning of this month, 3.6 billion recovered by the Department of Justice on something from a couple years back. Is crypto any different in this area that we seem to have these high profile where the hackers are returning this? Like, I don't know, because of its openness, because of its ability for people to kind of fixate on the blockchain. Does that matter at all in this space? Are we seeing crypto being tested in the same way that some of these other, ransomware type schemes are being tested? And does that bode well for crypto to see some of this money find its way back? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
It's interesting because, we've talked about what is the level of maturity you need to trust in the assurance of something that claims to afford better security. And so we've been talking for years about how blockchain as a technology underlying crypto, has represented this great leap forward as a technology capability to do decentralized ledgers and to provide security features that you can't get in a centralized model. And yet we've seen the promises associated with cryptocurrencies operating on top of those have yet kind of, there's no silver bullet for security there, that, these exchanges have vulnerabilities in them themselves. And even in blockchain, the attacks are there. They vary in their complexity. Some are security related issues, some are privacy related issues. But I don't, when Bitcoin first came out and people thought wait a second, this is going to be bulletproof. It's not going to be traced. Like you can trace things in the ledger, but you can't attribute necessarily. And a lot of that script has been flipped. You don't have a recovery of money in a cryptocurrency without some of those concerns being very real. And we've seen several cases in the last couple of years of people losing millions of dollars they had in these currencies based on vulnerabilities in the exchange. And so it raises a lot of questions about, well, how much trust do you put in something that really isn't insured and vetted to what standard, right? Like cryptocurrency has been assessed again by a lot of people from various angles, but the blockchain was the focus because that's what the standard was. Well, what was the standard though for now all these different exchanges and currencies popping up and leveraging that technology? And are they implementing them all in the same ways? And well, can we really identify the differences between how one currency is implemented from another? And when none of these things are regulated or insured to nearly the extent that traditional, financial systems are, it makes you kind of wonder, like, we've taken this great leap forward, but are we going to start plugging ships again because we didn't agree on standards? And it's kind of like the age old problem in technology where you go read the Internet Task Force bulletins, or you read RFCs, and we're using RFCs in parts of industry today that have been in draft for 30 years, and yet it's the best thing that we have as a standard, and that's what gets implemented. And then people, despite all having the same paper in front of them, reading what the standard is, they go ahead and implement that standard in slightly modified ways from what's written. And this results in non-deterministic, unexpected behavior. So from that perspective, it's an ongoing education campaign. And then really we wonder, do we have structural or infrastructure issues with blockchain? And do we really understand who the miners are, who's running these servers, what financial policies are regulating these exchanges, like who actually owns the data when it's decentralized? There's a lot of questions there we really haven't unpacked as a society, and we're making it up as we go along and watching the consequences fall out. So yeah, it's not only interesting from a fact that Bitcoin has gone almost purely speculative at this point. Like, it's unclear if we're in gambling territory with it, or if it's just, kind of the favorite thing that someone wants to bet $1,000 on versus an actual real mature currency system. But the technology has showed it is mature enough to not only catch the eyes of, every major government, but, you're looking at the US considering issuing their own digital currency now. Well, why is that? Because they're trying to assert themselves in the narrative and discussion of, well, we don't think this financial technology revolution is going away anytime soon, but we better have an answer that does have some of the regulation and insurance and other aspects that people expect of a traditional financial system that have arguably been lacking in today's kind of lesser Wild West, but still modestly wild, with occasional dust storms rolling through, which is what we see today.
Well, you're absolutely right. The exchange network, whatever that is the weak link on this. We've created this, that we've created these currencies, these, whatever you want to call them. And then people were like, well, we want to do things with them. And the exchanges have just been a mess. I mean, they you watch them, and every currency kind of come. We're probably on V3 at this point, I think, when we think about the ones that have survived. And I think there is quite a bit of scrutiny now happening on them. They do seem better than they were before, but there's just a lot of shenanigans going on out there. And it's just, I don't think it's right for the average consumer at this point. Just, it's completely ununderstandable for them. And they're just like, what happens if I lose my password? You're like, well, okay, that's probably the wrong question to ask. Google recently automatically, I think, again, in our time that we were away, automatically two-factored 150 million email addresses, and have seen in this time, 50%, it's halved the Gmail hacks that they've seen in the past. They've seen a decrease by half. Is that where we're going to have to go, Christian, when we think about the consumer footprint? Are we going to have to be more, are we going to have to pull out the dad card? Say, no, you're going to put two-factor on these things, right? I mean, what's the real, from a consumer standpoint, what's the real answer to continue? Because the consumer continues to be the weak link.
And it's honestly, I think the MFA thing is inevitable. I think we're going to be at a point where people are MFAing into their desktops and laptops at home the same way they would at work. I think, you're already seeing things like iOS that can do face login. That's one form of factor. Maybe there's going to be a second factor. Short story there is that, like, personal habits are going to be forced to change, but it's not just Google that's doing this, right? Like, one of the big maybe shocks to many home consumers was, wait, my computer that I bought 4 years ago is not compatible with Windows 11 because this TPM chip is missing. What? And so like even Microsoft has really raised the bar to say, wait a second, like you're not going to like, this operating system was built to a certain bar and it requires a certain set of hardware. And in almost every other release of the Windows operating system, it's been about like meeting a minimum set of system requirements. And now those minimum set of requirements kind of look not so minimum. They just look like requirements, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of changes, with Windows 11, for example. If you're mandating TPM, like now we're talking about everyone's hard drive being encrypted at rest by default, right? Like I'm not going to be able to walk into your house, pull out the hard drive of your computer and start reading your data. Like where's the decryption key, right? So those are things that we wouldn't have been talking about even 2 years ago, I think. And then, you have this class of vulnerabilities that took the world by storm in the end of 2021 with Log4j, which was practically earth-shattering. I mean, everyone was running around crazy for several days patching all of the things because, Java is used on over 3 billion devices. 3 billion, it's probably more than that by now. And when you have 3 billion devices all running Java and many software, folks using common shared open source libraries like Log4j that has it's this beautiful 0-day remote executable vulnerability waiting for everyone. Even that gets you to this place where it's an example of a more complex threat that had broad impacts, where MFA wasn't going to help you, right? So it's like there's this weird scale we're tilting right now where, again, the low-hanging fruit is going to keep going down because you're going to be pulling the dad card out more and more. And it's like, yeah, you're not going to log into an IMAP server without 2FA or a code generation. You're not going to use a machine that doesn't just decrypt at rest by default. But we still don't, we still have, I think, a lot of work to figure out what are the standard set of things that prevent the types of vulnerabilities that we saw last year. Log4j being, one of the classic examples.
And seemingly off the news cycle already. Like,
yeah, classic mainstream media of cover for 3 days by storm and then disappear into the night. But in terms of, industry that's been working on this, it was like a week of around the clock efforts, I'm sure, for, most everyone around the world trying to patch their Java things. And, the fallout in the technical and the security industry for this is, people are having interesting debates around open source versus closed source and like what's the right, like how do you trust your software supply chain, right? Like that's a huge topic right now in terms of is it better for me to write all my own libraries and introduce my own bugs because I'm trying to recreate fundamental infrastructure, or do we continue to trust these open source packages that everyone uses, scrutinize them closely, and when inevitably human fallacy does get introduced, we have quick mechanisms to stop the bleeding, which was put to the test with Log4j like no other, right? Like how do you stop the bleeding immediately? But these vulnerabilities are going to remain, and like I noted with iOS, where the number of 0-day RCEs has gone uncomfortably up, like that is a good driving example of how low-hanging fruit's continuing to go down, complexity and motivation to carry out these sophisticated attacks is going up, and with that, the blast radius is still fairly volatile, because yes, Log4j had this huge blast radius in terms of everyone was impacted more or less. But do we really have good data on how many people were materially impacted who maybe didn't patch in time, or maybe it was used before it was disclosed? Like, that data is much more ambiguous, right? Whereas the data we were looking at before was, we couldn't do basic security as an industry, and so data breaches were left and right, and the material impact was very easy to measure because it was, well, here's everyone's social security number, bank account login, etc.
John's got a question out there in the chat. Talking earlier, and I'm going to morph this question a little bit, but he says, is that security posture proof being driven by the cyber insurance industry as well? And it's just as we think about this becoming more and more of a big financial deal for organizations, not just cyber insurance, but insurance in general, of thinking about companies, taking out policies to protect themselves from this kind of activity. And then, of course, insurance companies are always the ones that are able to enact like they become, because they see the monetary impact it has on them and their success, they get these things kind of taken care of. Is that happening at all in the cyberspace? Are we seeing insurance companies driving some innovation or driving change, or helping enforce some of that because they know it's in their financial best interest?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is similar to the health insurance industry, right? Where is the health insurance industry allowed to charge you more money now for things like pre-existing conditions, or should they be allowed to collect data on how many times you exercise a week to help determine whether or not your premium is higher or lower? It's much the same argument in many respects. Now, that has more of a personal privacy aspect to it than the cyber insurance argument. But, insurance is absolutely a game of how much measured risk can I handle against the pot of money, and is my risk higher than what is insured? And so I absolutely expect those conversations are happening. It's unclear to me at what level they are driving the conversation right now. But the reputational damage of a company alone is sufficient that I don't think they need an insurance industry necessarily convincing them that they, need to be doing things, because it takes one, major issue, and you've, reputationally damaged your company or your product or your service to a point where no one's going to use it. And trust is hard to gain and easy to lose. So unlike, health insurance, where maybe individuals do or don't need more motivation to take care of themselves, but insurance providers have largely been handcuffed from crossing some of the data privacy and boundary laws to handle putting someone on their plan. With cyber insurance, I'm absolutely, and John brings up a good point. That's like, some insurance companies aren't going to even agree to cover you unless you have basic things like 2FA. But if you're looking for cyber insurance, chances are you're a large enough enterprise at that point that you should have these things. And if you don't, it's interesting that you are looking for the insurance before those things are in place, because to me that says you think insurance is the answer, moreover than the investment in your infrastructure to protect your customers. So it's unclear how much of that is a CYA move. I think insurance has maybe a role to play in the conversation, but I don't think they are the right entity to be kind of driving the minimum set of policies. For all the great regulatory things we come up with in the United States, this seems like a ripe area for regulation that is currently maybe underregulated. And would benefit from, we have a lot of standard set of guidance that people can choose to follow or not to follow, but there's not a lot of mechanisms for regulatory reform that ensures that those standards are being implemented when you are enacting in certain types of business. At the state level, this looks actually pretty different because some states are taking a much more proactive policy on passing laws that hold companies at much greater level of liability for cyber breaches. They also hold companies at liability for failures to have disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, cybersecurity incident response plans. And so like, New York State's a classic example where you pretty much can't operate anything nonprofit, for-profit, otherwise, unless you have a documented disaster recovery and business continuity plan on file with the organization. There's the next level up is focused on the cybersecurity aspect and the data breaches, et cetera. So there are some levers starting to appear, and insurance maybe is one that's accessible to everyone, but I'm not seeing any clear or consistent lever that applies across industry to really get folks to the table.
John wants to counter your statement there about reputation, your reputation argument with the RSA intrusion from a few years back. RSA came through fine despite security being their business. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is an interesting counter data point. I think one of the things that make RSA in a different position from other companies is that security is their lifeline in their blood, right? So obviously if they get it wrong, it's a bad day for everyone, and they, got it wrong to some extent, but they were much better prepared than your average company was to have the tools needed to earn the customer's trust back. In many of these other businesses that are in many respects flying by the seat of their pants for their security posture, especially in small business, they have not invested their entire livelihood in how to build the most secure thing. And so it's much easier for a company not focused in security to permanently damage customer trust if they've lost customer data because they didn't invest the time or attention, or you can prove negligence. With RSA, it's really hard for customers to look at that and say, oh, they were totally negligent. Like they had no idea what they were doing. They abused my data. Why would I ever give my money to this institution? Not only that, but RSA doubled down by releasing new products and capabilities that, permanently address those types of vulnerabilities. So it's one thing to say you're going to do it. It's another thing to kind of double down. I think if I remember correctly, when that happened, they reissued like all the tokens at no cost and invested in that next kind of platform. So yeah, valid counterpoint. But I would say somewhat of an exception. More interesting ones are, to me, ones like SolarWinds, right? Like what's the 411 reputational aftermath of SolarWinds? I haven't looked since it has been a thing. But there's an example of a company that claims to have done, kind of that IT infrastructure management and holistic patch management, software management for industry, and a bunch of folks place trust in that platform. And the difference there was it wasn't like some fairly, hard technical problem like RSA had to deal with. It was, oh, the intern put the default password on the update distribution server, and that allowed, an attacker to put their malware in to, in essence, infect the supply chain of what SolarWinds was delivering to lots and lots of companies. And so I don't have great, reputational sentiment analysis, but I'm a betting man, and I, watch the stock market and believe that the stock market can tell us a lot about what customer sentiments and moods are for an industry. And if you look at, SolarWinds at December 11th, 2020, their share price was at $24.83. If you look at the share price today, February 16th, it's $13.45 a share. So the company has lost about 50% of its net worth as a publicly traded company since December 28th. And if we line that up to the breach, that breach occurred in May of 2019. Okay, so let's zoom back a little further. And in May of 2019, the share was at around $20 a share. So yeah, they seem to have rallied. They seem to have had a major pullback, but it's not clear to me. Like if someone told me, hey, do you recommend SolarWinds? Hell no. I wouldn't tell you to go buy that. I would tell you to keep arm's length away from that stuff, irrespective of whether or not they patched it, because it wasn't clear that they were being responsible with the level of trust placed in them. Whereas like RSA was being responsible, they still damaged trust, but it's hard to argue that it was because of negligence, whereas SolarWinds in many respects was a big part in terms of the negligence on the company.
John may have a point, as we think about Equifax, that didn't see a negative stock, with their 2017 breach, didn't see a negative and are actually up over that. I do, to John's point a little bit, Christian, and to go back to the data, the 68% increase in 2021, do you think there could be a little bit of, public, we just can't handle
apathy,
those kinds of numbers? Yeah, well, I wouldn't even say it's not caring. There's just so much of it. I can't keep track of it all. I'll be honest, until John mentioned Equifax just a minute ago, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I guess that did. That's a big deal when it happened. And it's like, well, okay. Well, you mentioned SolarWinds. I remember thinking about that last year. Was that last year? See,
it was a 2021 greatest hit. So I'm glad we're talking about it.
Yeah. But you're kind of like, I kind of wonder from a public standpoint if these have gotten so spectacular, they've written themselves out of the narrative because they're not, they're just not that exciting anymore from a news cycle standpoint. People are like, well, okay, it's happening to everybody. We got to kind of figure this thing out,
Yeah, and I think that's fair. There's another interesting dimension to that example that John brings up, which is like credit bureaus. It's the Tri-State Credit Bureau. It's a very vendor-locked, constrained space, much like the cell phone space in the US is like you have three main providers now, like pick your poison. And I think people have much more choice in what they choose and what they pick for something like a software IT lifecycle management company like SolarWinds. So I think there's much more diversity there where people can choose to put their money elsewhere. And Tri-State credit bureaus, which are very regulated as they are, not like you and I are going and buying an Equifax product. We're kind of like, we're very impacted. They measure our credit scores, they report things out, but we're not really buying a product from them. So you and I don't get as much of an ownership stake in setting the direction of Equifax, so to speak, as maybe we do choosing security product A from security product B. Now I got my timelines a little bit backwards trying to do the SolarWinds timeline in my brain. The news became public December 13th of 2020, and the public response began in December 15th of 2020. So 2021 was mostly like, let's clean up from all the SolarWinds things. But if you look at this stock market ticker, SolarWinds had hit its highest share evaluation of 24.83 on December 11th, 2020. So this is following very consistently, mind you, the kind of COVID crash and recovery in the broader market. But they're at right up to the breach, have never been higher, right? 24.83. And then within, by December 24th, which is now a week after public disclosure, they're down to 1661. So they've wiped, about 40% of their market share out overnight. And the closest they rallied back very briefly was summer of 2021, kind of came back up, but now they're, back down into this new low territory of 13. So I don't know. Mm-hmm. It clearly shows you that people were spooked by it. It's unclear. We'd probably need to look at another couple of years for this company's graph to really make a speculation. But I think ownership in, do you have alternative options plays a big role in whether or not that customer trust actually results in the damage of people leaving your platform or your service.
Mm-hmm. It's a good discussion, right? I don't think there's any always a clear correlation, to your point. Say Verizon was in the middle of a gigantic breach here in the United States. It's certainly going to take a hit. Is it going to ruin them forever? Probably not. They hold the lion's share control of the cell phone market here in the United States. So you don't really know, right? I mean, I don't think that's one of those things you're like, it'll be okay. Well, our reputation will be fine. Let's not do that, right? I think that's the thing that you want to guard against, or what you're really kind of saying is, do you really want to roll the dice? Are you that interested in rolling the dice? Brian had asked a question earlier, Christian. I think that's maybe one we kind of wrap on as we think about this. He says, but in thinking about this topic and possible cyber terrorism, I wonder how our infrastructure security compares to other nations. And, I'm not asking you to break that down, but just as we think about the overall, the United States has a huge footprint and a huge target. How do just on the surface, how do we compare? And any thoughts on that as we think, because that's going to, I think about what's going on in Ukraine right now. It's going to be a bigger deal with these players.
It is super hard to speculate. I in many respects, I sometimes wish we had another 10 years of data to look at for the next 10 years to then see hindsight 2020 beforehand. So the crystal ball is a little bit hard on this one. And there's this whole unrelated aspect to your question that I think influences the answer a little bit, around how just geopolitical volatility in general will influence our supply chain, which will influence our decision making and how we're building, securing, and defending these systems, right? So like we talk about Russia and Ukraine, and this, we've seen some of the accusations of cyber attacks there, but now let's play out a scenario where China decides to invade Taiwan, and now 90% of the silicon chips needed to produce computers is not available for export. And like, what does that do to fundamental things that just kind of keep the lights on, yet alone actually build and create new security products that are going to improve this landscape one way or another? So I don't know that I have a great answer there at the moment.
Yeah, and not really expecting you to have one. I think we still got a lot of things ahead on that front. And I years ago we looked at a map, that has, I think we looked at that on Cyber Frontiers here, where it kind of shows attacks around the world as these things are happening kind of in real time. And it's I haven't looked at that in a long time.
I know.
And you got to kind of wonder now what it looks like, right? And what's changed.
Well, but it's one of those things where I would not be surprised if the volume of attacks hasn't changed, but the percentage of successful ones has, right? So just like in the Gmail example, right? Like people are probably still trying at the same volume as they were previously, but now these strategies are failing. And so as they have to adapt their strategies to be more sophisticated, I think you're going to see less volume because they're going to have to spend more time really crafting the right thing. So volume will go down, but when one of these things is right and it's done at scale, in many respects, it takes away any kind of notion of an early warning indicator, right? Like, oh, we're seeing a lot of attacks from this source to this destination trying to do this thing. And well, now chances are, no, we're going to get more to a state where the name of the game is who can, privately in their own confines of their hacker space, come up with the next 0 day that they can weaponize, prepare, and utilize. And you're not going to see it coming, right? There was no brute force testing of it. It's just, okay, time to roll it out. So that map might look very different in terms of attempts, but in terms of the players and the flows, probably pretty similar.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to put a cost analysis on that to say what's the cost of the attacks, because I think that's what you're getting to, is it's costing more. They're more sophisticated, requires more effort, might mean more cycles, right? Even the human effort is getting harder and harder to trick humans into it, and so maybe they're just more costly as well, which ups the ante for everybody, right? It's, I think, what we want, but it just ups the ante for everybody and makes those things more, which means the payoff needs to be more, right?
Yeah.
Needs to be deeper, needs to be bigger.
Well, and ransomware certainly has been a bigger, way to get payoff on the cheap. Like you don't need to be broadly successful. You just need one that's willing to say yes to paying, right?
Right.
And usually that is at a large sum. There's going to be different types of payoffs, though, as that becomes less and less viable, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Brian says, great response, Christian. I too think about the issue regarding the chip shortage and where they're manufactured linked to national security. Intel just announced a $20 billion, whatever, I forget the number, in Ohio.
Yeah.
And, you kind of go, oh, now you think about the Rust Belt, right? As you think about that part of the United States and it needing jobs, and, it could be a situation where some of those in that site that they picked has potential to grow to 10 times bigger than it is today. That's just their initial investment. And interesting to see, we may see some of those chip manufacturers make their way back on shore and see some things done here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a little bit of Looney Tunes speculation, but I mean, kind of stop and think about what happens when one geopolitical segment owns, let's just say, a broad portion of the supply chain. And so you're not able to get the parts that you need or the things that you need. And then also, like, on the flip side of that argument, there's a lot of hardware coming from a lot of different places right now that is exported and imported accordingly. That, how do you vet that chip is a Intel 12th generation processor to spec? Like, how do you know? Like, 99% of the people in the home or home enthusiasts building their computer, they're not, there's no assurance test that, like, here's the seal and stick it in the motherboard and boot the thing, right? So
no checksum.
From the perspective of everyone dependent on these what I would call fairly brittle supply chains that everyone, whether they like it or not, they're using them. There's something to be said for how do we get to the next state as industry at large for vetting things and having software vet that hardware is what it is, right? Like, you should be able to have your system know the difference between a legitimate or a fraudulent, and again, fraudulent defined as hardware modified in some way, whether that's firmware, whether that's some change on the board itself, whatever, from its baseline. And then on the flip side, you have a massive supply chain disruption, and that changes over time who has access to what hardware at what scale, doing what things. And so some of these are short-term issues, some of these are potentially long-term, but I very much think who controls the supply chain and who is able to get parts when is a very important part of the discussion for understanding what will be the trend or pattern of attacks over time, because you can do different types of attack with different hardware. You're going to target different types of platform based on the probability of X chip versus Y chip being in those systems. Like, there's a lot of weird niche analysis you get into when you just think about, okay, what does it mean for the supply chain sources to change from X to Y, or from the volume to go up or down? Then there's the second meta point around just how do you validate and vet your hardware supply chain using software things and making it available to the average consumer so that they don't even, they're not aware about it. It's almost like, if you're running a illegitimate copy of Windows, like, even if Microsoft lets you still run it, they're going to pop up and tell you, right? Like, it's fairly, they can do that in their sleep, tell you if you're running a genuine copy. Can we do that with arbitrary hardware parts today? Debatable for at the average guy level. And is it baked into these products to the point where you'll know if there's a problem if they tell you, but it's not like you have to go and do something as the average guy. And then there's just this third, segment of, what are we really doing to, humorously, much like blockchain decentralizing some financial systems, what are we really doing to decentralize our supply chain and chip capability, really on a global scale, to be quite honest, right? Because it's very disproportionate in terms of who's producing chips and exporting to who. And it's going to have major implications in the security space moving forward, especially when you look at things like in 2020, Spectre and Meltdown, which were big deal topics, right? And these were, foundational security flaws in the hardware. Now, it wasn't like someone compromised or tainted the supply chain, but what if the story headline was Spectre and Meltdown caused not because of a firmware bug that's been pre-existing that Intel and AMD had, but because someone slipped it in and no one noticed, or manufacturing plant X modified the boards and they slipped right through validation testing as good to go, and they now allowed this vulnerability to be there that otherwise wasn't designed for.
Yeah. Genuine testing, right? This quality, not quality, but is this being delivered what it was intended to be, or has someone modified it in some way?
And look, when we talk about, kind of raising the standards and qualities of that basic infrastructure, to the next level, it's not just everyone does MFA and we get better and better at software. Infrastructure is foundationally, it's going to be hardware just as much. And the economic, geopolitical, and, real world aspects of hardware supply chain have equally complex but different characteristics than software supply chain security. But in the aggregate, if your supply chain for these things is not healthy or not verifiable at scale, then your implementation of zero trust or any of these other things is only as good as you trust the vendors and the supply that's putting them in place.
How can I zero trust my iPhone? I have to have, I get the phone. I can't zero trust it. I'm trusting that the hardware, the software may be easier to validate than the hardware on that one. And I can't put any zero trust in place for the hardware on that phone. So it's an interesting idea, I think, from a consumer standpoint. How do I guarantee that the hardware being delivered to me does not have malicious built into it from the factory, or built into it from a chip manufacturer that provided it at the factory, right? And how do I know that phone's not going to turn on me, at some point, and guarantee it? Today, I think we take that for granted, Christian. I really do. I think we just go, yep, it's okay. I don't, it's not like I boot the phone and then check it, right? And maybe we should, right? Maybe there should be some kind of authorization, something for the hardware.
Well, and it's there's all sorts of things from a firmware level around like sign drivers and like Apple's obviously putting things in their operating system that they're going to know if you're trying to boot it on something that's not an iPhone. But I'm talking about much more like minutia sleight of hand things that are, in theory, if you have a properly vetted firmware platform and instruction set, you should be able to do complete proofs of your hardware. But think about how especially married the iPhone software is to its hardware, and then think about how diverse the hardware to software ecosystem is in a lot of other types of systems, where there isn't that very tight coupling, and there's no real standard for how to do it when you're in those hybrid environments of software and hardware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it should have a way of protecting me if there was some kind of hardware modification that was injected in some form or fashion that could be done. Even if we think about a Bluetooth injection, right, that flips something in a hardware setting or whatever. I'm making this up, but I don't have any kind of protection against that in some ways. If at least today, it's not zero trust for me on the hardware. So
yeah,
interesting stuff. As we get together next month, one of the things that's just driving me nuts in this topic, and maybe we can just spend a little time talking about it, is I do feel like because of the supply chain problems, we're seeing increased prices in computer parts, and then that's created a gray market that we're the problem because we keep buying these things off the gray market.
Yeah.
And I think we need them, but we really don't, right? I kind of wish we could institute some discipline in our own purchasing problems to say, no, I'm not going to buy that $1,000 Xbox. That's obviously because of a supply chain manipulation, because of bots who've bought these things right before humans could. And then we're actually supporting that crime, right? I think it's a crime in some ways by buying these things that we really shouldn't be outside the supply chain, so maybe we can chat a little bit about that next time.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. And the consumer trends obviously play a big role in this too, right? Because there's, to your point, those gray markets are not easily disturbed.
Yeah. Listen, the madness just around video cards. It's like, no, I need it now. Do you? Like, do you really need it? No, I need it now. And it's just one of those kinds of things. Like, no, I get you're trying to do some things, but just let's punish the people who have done this by not giving in. We have control over those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
We control the supply and demand in a lot of ways, and let's punish those that overpaid or whatever. At some point, supply and demand will fix itself and make it right. It just drives me nuts to see, and I live in this space because all these YouTubers and stuff, they're gotta have it now. I'm like, no, you don't. You don't have to have it now type deal. Let's have a little discipline in this, just drives me nuts. We'll talk about that. We'll bring that subject up. We will get you back here on a regular basis now, and we'll get at least one of these a month kind of schedule. I think that's probably the right pace for this, and get some time together. Christian, thanks for coming back. Thanks for doing 65 of these with me. Tons of fun to think of. We've been doing this for 7 years. No, 8 years. 7? When did you start? Because it was right before you started school, right?
I want to say it was, maybe it was earlier. I thought it was 2015, but
it's very possible. Yeah, we'll have to go back and take a look.
Cool.
Well, thanks for coming out. A couple reminders here. Of course, the AverageGuy.tv, powered by Maple Grove Partners. Secure, reliable, high-speed hosting from folks that you know and that you trust. MapleGrovePartners.com. I think plans still as little as $10. And
we're inflation proof.
Whipping inflation. Just this. See, this is where you should spend your money. Like inflation. fighting inflation every day of the week. If you have questions, you want us to cover us a topic, send me an email, jim@theaverageguy.tv. You can contact Christian @theaverageguy.tv. Shoot us a note on Twitter @jcollison, and Christian is @Borg Whisper. Thanks for coming out tonight. We'll stay around for just a minute or two of post show. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody. Hey guys, thanks for coming out tonight. Ken, Brian, John. I know Tony was out there a little bit earlier. And I think I got everybody on that one. Thanks for coming out. It was fun to see you guys. Like I said, Christian, before we hang up tonight, I'm going to make sure I've got you scheduled for a March. I think we did that last time, but I'll just double check. So you hang tight for me 1 second. We'll let everybody so that John, you're my hero, John Biggs. You made it all the way through.
You made it.
You're the wind beneath my wings. I love it. Let's see if we can do 2 in a row. Christian's back tomorrow night talking home theater stuff. I'm pretty pumped about that. This is going to be to get you 2 nights in a row.
It's going to be good.
That's pretty great. So live folks, thanks for coming out. John, thanks for staying up. Brian, appreciate that. And we will see you guys tomorrow night, same time.